in the back, but we'll go on and get started anyway. I always like to start off something this important with something really deep, but I don't really have anything deep to say. So what I would like to do is to welcome you to the second annual Washington University Black Alumni Council Scholarship Dinner Dance. We are very, very excited to have all of you here tonight with our guest speaker. In case you're kind of curious about how many bodies are in this room, we're probably tipping the scales of just a little bit under 700. And that's almost 300 more than we had last year. If I haven't met you yet, my name is Karen Drake. I'm a graduate of Washington University Graduate School, Arts and Sciences, 1981. And if I have not met you or at least been by your table, it certainly is not that I didn't want to. But one of the things that we want to make sure that we do tonight is, number one, enable you all to have a good time. Number two, and I see a person that was a mentor of mine walking through there. Hi now. Number two, to recognize the people that have made a lot of this happen. Number three, enable you to listen to one of the best and most, I won't say controversial, but colorful political figures, I think, in our time, as well as a very nice and fun person. And also, for you to be able to demonstrate by your check writing, in addition to your ticket purchase, for you to demonstrate your support to helping the St. Louis chapter develop an endowed fund for Black Americans. So we appreciate your ticket sales. $15 of every ticket will go to the scholarship, but don't feel like you gotta stop there. I know a lot of you still have checkbooks, and I know that a lot of you have got pens, and if you don't, we've got plenty up here. So there are people outside that welcome your donations. To give you an idea of what kinds of things have happened to put this program together, other than February starting out with the freeing of Nelson Mandela. This is also Black History Month, and a lot of us are feeling like this is a very special evening and a very special month for a lot of things to happen. There are a lot of people in this room that at some point during the evening, I hope that you take the time to introduce yourselves to. Some of the things that have precipitated this event: the Black Alumni Council St. Louis chapter has held 2 phone-a-thons this year, getting all of you out from your houses. We know some of you have come across the miles, our national president being one, and that a lot of you have really made a lot of changes in your schedules and sacrifices of your time and expense to be here with us, and we truly appreciate that. The university has been tremendously supportive to us in getting this entire event together. As you might know, the purpose of the Black Alumni Council is to assist in the recruitment and the retention of qualified Black students. One of the other purposes of the council is to work in partnership with Washington University, the university community, as well as St. Louis at large. And our primary purpose is to support higher education for talented Black Americans. What we intend to do in our second annual event is to begin an endowed fund where we will be supporting current Washington University students. So maybe there is a student or two that may be short on some expenses. Possibly we can help to supplement any existing scholarships or financial aid. What we are also interested in doing is encouraging high school students, college-bound high school students, to attend the university. Because if most of us probably know, and I assume you believe this to be true or you wouldn't be here, that Washington University is a pretty impressive and obviously worldwide known, but it's a pretty good university from which to get an education. And that's the main goal for us to be here, and we thank you. What I'd like to do also is to get moving into the programs, because there are other people up here that will be speaking to you, and they're interesting, and they have a lot of interesting things to share with you. One second. I was writing a couple things that I did, and my husband said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to figure out like what I'm going to say." Of course, my dearest friend there, expecting my godchild to be, says, "Didn't you do this before?" And I said, "Well, I did it a little bit on the plane." And anyway, one of the things that is difficult for me to do is to say enough about someone that has done so much. And we are so proud to have our guest speaker with us this evening. The reason that our guest came to Congress some 20 years ago was not just to admonish many of the atrocities of the Vietnam War era, nor just to attack the spiraling racism in America, particularly in the early 60s, but to speak for those unable to speak for themselves. A lifetime advocate of equal opportunity in the quality of life, our speaker has spent the majority of his life demanding justice, freedom, and fairness for all, not just the less fortunate. This person is often viewed as the conscience of our United States Congress. I will not list all of his accolades because there really are too many. We had a very lively and fun discussion at lunch today about mental health in this country and a lot of different worldwide issues. We have similar academic backgrounds, so because he is an MSW. So he says, you know, I'm really away from clinical work right now. And I said, you know, Ron, not really, because you're applying a lot of those same skills and a lot of the really good and important work that you're doing. We feel very privileged to have him here tonight, just 1 week prior to his departure to South Africa. He is going to be meeting with Nelson Mandela next week and other dignitaries in South Africa. We feel very honored, and it is my truest pleasure to introduce to you the Honorable Ronald B. Dellums, Congressman from California.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the chairperson for a very kind and generous introduction. My distinguished colleagues of the dais and brothers and sisters, it's a special pleasure and great privilege for me to address you this evening. I consider this a very significant and important podium from which to speak. Since this is a scholarship banquet, the framework of this evening is academic framework. I will struggle as valiantly as I can to try to be substantive and analytical, hopefully in the finest tradition of academic environment. And since this is about young people, the future and the tomorrows of our lives, I wish to speak about the future and the tomorrow, but beginning with an analysis of where we are at this moment. Just 2 weeks ago, a very interesting thing occurred. I'm the third-ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, and I chair the subcommittee on research and development. I represent a very progressive constituency in California. I was elected in 1970 against the backdrop of a very tumultuous period, the 1960s, where we struggled for civil and human rights, the liberation of black and third world people and women, to bring an end to the insanity of America's prosecution of a war in Southeast Asia. So I was sent to Congress to raise my voice in the name of peace and freedom and justice. And 2 weeks ago, the House Armed Services Committee hosted a very interesting group of people. They were members of the Supreme Soviet from the Soviet Union. They were members of their military and security committee. In other words, these were our Soviet counterparts. We met for breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning. We talked across the table with simultaneous translation. And then they journeyed with us to the Armed Services Committee hearing room. I walked into the hearing room. This is the bastion of conservatism, room 2118 of the Rayburn building, Armed Services Committee. And I walked in to take my seat, and in the back of the room, for the first time in the 19 plus years that I've been in the Congress, there was a translation booth. The sign said, Channel 6, English, Channel 7, Russian, in the Armed Services Committee room. I've lived so long. And on one side of the room, there were vacant seats for my Soviet colleagues to come and sit, scores of them. The witness before the Armed Services Committee that day was the Secretary of the Air Force and the Commanding General of the Air Force to bring the Air Force's portion of the fiscal year 1991 military budget. The stealth bomber, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the MX missile, etc., etc. So they gave the testimony. Chairman and others began to raise questions, and then the chair recognized me. Gentleman from California, Mr. Douglas. So I began by saying, Mr. Chairman, I cannot resist making the following observation. I've been in Congress now in my 20th year, and for 19 consecutive years, my colleagues have said each year, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And each year I stood up and said, this is madness. The Russians are not coming. The Russians are not coming. The Russians are not coming. But Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I must now publicly apologize for having made a significant mistake. They're here, Mr. Chairman. They are here in America. But I hasten to make the second observation, and that the Soviets were in Washington, D.C., in the House Armed Services Committee hearing room, not in the context of war or in the atmosphere of hostility, but rather in the context of peace and in the atmosphere of exchange, information, understanding, communication, cooperation. Why do I begin by giving you that observation as the backdrop for the remarks that I will make this evening? Because my point is that not only is the world changing, the world has changed. The world has changed in very bold and powerful and significant ways. The world has changed in manner that in ways that would be unthinkable just 3 months ago. Who would have thought that a group of people without a shot being fired by simply with the power of ideas bring down the Berlin Wall? Who would have thought just a few short months ago that people in Eastern Europe could have toppled governments, not with bombs and bullets and missiles, but with the simple desire for freedom and democracy and to change their way of life? When hundreds of thousands of people just stood up simultaneously and said, that's the end of that. Would any of us in this room believe 3 months ago, we had all said, Mandela will be free in February. The ANC will be legalized in February. And that the president of South Africa and the ANC would begin to communicate openly in February. You would have said, what are you drinking? And whatever the motivation of the government of South Africa, change has come in irrevocable ways It is now inevitable. Change will come. It is simply what price and what speed. But the inevitable fact is that South Africa has now been placed on a course that is irreversible. It must change. And maybe I'll even be able to shave off this beard, because I grew it when I went to jail before the South African embassy, and I said I'll keep it until Nelson Mandela is free and all of my people in South Africa can walk in freedom and dignity. We are now about that business. So the world has changed, and the world continues to change on a daily basis. Yet the unfortunate and tragic reality is that when we look at our political leadership as it is reflected in our national budget at this moment, it does not reflect the bold and incredible changes that have occurred in the world. As a brief aside, the reason why I focus on the budget, if I were told that I was going to another country and I could only read one document that would tell me as much as I needed to know about another nation, what would that one document be? I would read their national budget. Because where a nation spends its money is a statement about its priorities, which in turn is a statement about its values and its principles, what it indeed holds significant and important. So let's look now against the backdrop of these extraordinary changes at America's budget. We're still advocating in excess of $300 billion on a military budget. We still are talking about buying modernized nuclear weapons to fight war in Europe, and who's the enemy? When the only thing the West Germans have to fear is being run over by the East Germans coming out of East Germany so quick. 3 months ago, this was great hostility. Now we're talking about the unification of Germany. So where are we going to put these new missiles? Who are we firing at? We still spend multi-billions of, do you know that we spend in excess of $160 billion per year to maintain our role in NATO? Over half of the American military budget is dedicated to America's role in NATO. And when the Eastern Europeans took down the Berlin Wall, we can't find a peace dividend in $160 billion where there are no longer conflict. But our military budget continues to march forward in lockstep, not against the backdrop of dramatic and bold changes. So our President and our Secretary of Defense says, well, but we must walk cautiously when the world is changing in very bold fashion. So our budget doesn't reflect that reality. We want to build a B-2 bomber. You've heard of the stealth bomber. I call it the Batmobile. Looks like a Batmobile. When the Soviets were in the room, you know, I was questioning the Secretary of the Air Force, and I said, well, this plane is going to cost us in excess of $70 billion. We're talking about one plane costing us between $600 and $700 million a plane. I mean, that's incredible. It staggers the imagination. So I said to the Secretary, look, if you can't see the plane, the Russians are here in the room. Just tell them we have 130. If they can't see them, how do they know they're lying? Incredible. At a time when the world is changing in very bold fashion, we want to go forward with Star Wars. This president wants to expand the amount of money for the Strategic Defense Initiative. It makes no sense. You know, when Reagan was president, he gave birth to Star Wars. And even the art proponents, you know, they were saying, well, we can develop a system that will take us back to the benign days when there were no nuclear weapons, to create this Houston Astrodome over America, and nuclear bombs would just bounce off. That we could make it 90% effective. Well, President Danforth, 90% on an exam at Washington University put you ahead of the curve in most classes. But a 90% effective system against nuclear weaponry still is mega death beyond comprehension.
Oh, wow.
If you don't believe it, think about this. Take an old umbrella and have someone cut holes in it so that it's a 90% effective umbrella. Put on your most expensive clothes. Take a journey around the block the next time it rains hard. And when you come back soaking wet from a 90% effective umbrella, think about Brian Dellum's comment and realize that that's not raindrops falling gently on your head, but a level of mega death beyond comprehension. And you will join me in A, realizing the absurdity of Star Wars, and B, the futility of spending tens of billions of dollars to build a weapon system that makes no sense. Star Wars is an absurd idea. As one much brighter than Brian Dellum once said, that once we've developed the capacity to use nuclear power to fight war, everything changed except the way we think. And if we think in some way that we can fight nuclear war, it makes no sense. Gorbachev is now saying, okay, I agree. You spin us into oblivion. I've got to make a decision about whether I build missiles or pay my miners, build more fighters or provide greater amounts of food for people. I opt to take care of my domestic issues. Well, should we not opt to do exactly the same thing? So our military budget doesn't reflect these new realities. Let's look at our domestic budget. Does it reflect the reality of the following reality? 1 out of every 2 black children in America lives in poverty. Every time a black child in America is born, there's a 50% chance that that child is born directly into poverty. 1 out of every 3 black women between the ages of 18 and 55 live in poverty. 1 out of every 4 black males in America, 18 to 55, live in poverty. 1 out of every 3 black senior citizens in America live in poverty. If you see a black or Hispanic woman who are sole head of household raising their children, greater than a 51% chance that that woman and her family live in poverty, one of the fastest growing groups of poverty-stricken human beings in America. There are 20 million people in America who are functionally illiterate. There are 13 million children, irrespective of race, who live in poverty. If you divide America up into 1/5 in terms of earning capacity, the top 1/5 of this country earns in excess of 42% of nearly 42% of all the income derived in this country. The bottom 1/5 earns less than 5% of all the income derived in America. Significance for black America that 50% of the black families in America live in the bottom 1/5 of the earning capacity of this nation. When Ronald Reagan took office in January of 1981, 48% of all the black children who managed to graduate from high school went on to college. That figure is now closer to 30%. At one time it dropped below 30%. And when you couple that with the fact that the Urban League points out that in certain urban metropolitan areas in this country, the dropout rate in black America exceeds 70%, how does that bode for the future? And does our national budget address those realities? Homelessness is on the rise in America.